and we'll begin. Give it a minute or two. All right, good evening and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica from Greenlight and we are thrilled to host tonight's pre-publication launch event with Joan Silber and her new book, Secrets of Happiness. She's going to be talking with Margot Livesey, so you are in for an excellent evening. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Joan, Margot, and the team at Counterpoint for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. A couple housekeeping things. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we do highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Secrets of Happiness, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. And Joan is graciously stopping by our store to sign stacks of the book tomorrow, so you can even get a signed copy. Just note your signed copy request in order comments when you order online. I'll drop that buy link in the chat in a minute. Or look for signed copies when you shop in our 2 bookstore locations in Brooklyn. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. All right, some introductions. Our interviewer tonight is Margot Livesey. She grew up on the edge of the Scottish Highlands and has taught in numerous writing programs, including Emerson College, Boston University, Bowdoin College, and the Warren Wilson Low Residency MFA program. She's the author of a collection of stories, 9 novels, including Eva Moves the Furniture and The Flight of Gemma Hardy, an essay collection, The Hidden Machinery, and her most recent novel, The Boy in the Field, was published in August 2020. She's on the faculty of the Iowa Writers Workshop and goes back to Scotland whenever she can. She's going to be speaking tonight with our featured author, Joan Silber. She's the author of 9 books of fiction. Her last book, Improvement, was the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award and the PEN/Faulkner Award, and was listed as one of the year's best books by the Washington Post. The Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Newsday, the Seattle Times, and Kirkus Reviews. Her previous book, Fools, was longlisted for the National Book Award and was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. Other works include The Size of the World, finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction, and Ideas of Heaven, finalist for the National Book Award and the Story Prize. She lives here in New York, has taught at Sarah Lawrence College, and teaches in the Warren Wilson MFA program. I'll confess I am personally an enormous Joan Silber fan, and her newest book, Secrets of Happiness, has the intimacy and surprise and sweep and insight that I've come to hope for from all of her books. As with all of them, I found myself sitting full of big, quiet thoughts after reading it. This is a story that ranges over 3 continents, encompassing families and loves and aspirations of many kinds. It's an exploration of the ways people marshal the resources at hand to forge their own forms of joy. And as always, it's an exploration of our inextricable interconnectedness to each other. So Margot is going to come on and give us a few words about Joan and before she begins to read tonight. So please join me in welcoming, to start us off, the wonderful Margot Livesey.
Thank you, Jessica, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Greenlight Bookstore. Thanks to all of you for coming. It's wonderful to see so many familiar names coming up in the chat, and it's also wonderful to see so many strangers. Both were a delight. And we're all here to celebrate Joan's marvelous new novel, Secrets of Happiness, which will be published tomorrow. Joan, many, many congratulations on this fabulous book. And I can't imagine a better introduction than to hear you read from the novel.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad to be here, and I'm thrilled to see all your names. Thank you for coming. I'm just going to read from the first page, or first pages. And this is It's a character named Ethan who's talking to you. My father was on the road a lot when I was growing up, off to parts of Asia to oversee the cheap manufacture of ladies' garments. You couldn't stay still, he said, in today's business world. Ever ask him about the local babes? One of my friends wanted to know. You should go with him next time, Ethan. He was just being a smartass. We were 15-year-old boys at the time, obnoxious whenever we could be. My father complained about too much time away from home. He missed us, he missed New York, and always came back with great presents. My mother and my sister got silk scarves and pearl necklaces. As a first grader, I had a Kung Fu t-shirt from Hong Kong. And as a teen, I had crazy pop tapes from Thailand. Mike, my friend, tried to get me to gamble away my tapes to him in a card game. In fact, I had a crush on Mike, a skinny loudmouth guy who was actually quite brainy and who had similar tastes in music. He was not my first crush, but I was still keeping those things to myself. It was the late 1980s, which were not as free as people like to remember. I lived in a world of heated imaginings, a long inner movie with a cast of highly appreciative lovers, culled from real life, rock and roll, TV, anything. It was a happier world, of course, than any I ever really entered. I wasn't out till my first year of college. In high school, everybody liked to hang around our apartment. It was homey and messy with sprawling rooms, very Upper West Side, and big for Manhattan. My mother left us alone. She taught school all day. She didn't need to see kids every minute. And then she'd burst forth at dinner, taking an interest, asking my friends the very questions they wanted to answer. Mike told her he believed in reincarnation, which I didn't even know. And my mother loved parties. When my father came home from a trip, she'd get all my friends to sing some goofy version of Love Shack. She'd have sparklers flaming away in a platter of pasta. Where am I? My father said. Is this the right house? He kept his arm around my mother's waist, beamed at all of us. My sister had to tell him every single thing she'd done in school. Home is the sailor, my mother said, home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill. My mother was always hoping to get to travel with him, maybe in the summer when she was off from teaching, but he avoided going when it was so hot over there. Over the years, his destination shifted as American outsourcing shifted in what he still called the rag trade. First, when I was little, it was Hong Kong, and then it seemed to be Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, and later China and Bangladesh. Every country is different, he said. My sister used to ask him about the languages. He could say hello and thank you in Cantonese, Thai, Bahasa Malaysia, which was almost the same as Bahasa Indonesia, Mandarin, and Bangla. Only hello and thank you? That's all, my sister said. Also, delicious and very good, he said. People speak English, they have to. They know we're idiots. Sometimes he took us to a favorite Thai restaurant in Queens, out in Elmhurst, where he traded a few phrases with the hostess, who always gave us a good table. The food was vastly better than any namby-pamby Thai food in Manhattan, and we bragged about it to our friends. My mother always meant to learn more about the textiles, which she was a big fan of, from getting all those scarves, and all the religions, Buddhists, Taoists, Communists, Muslims. Asia is fascinating, my father said, happy capitalist exploiter that he was. When his company merged with a bigger outfit, he bragged about making more money, but it was all the same to us.
Thank you, Joan. Hearing those paragraphs, those sentences, I just thought, oh, there is so much of the novel in them. And as you keep reading forward, it's like opening a treasure chest and finding all kinds of wonderful surprises. Could you tell us a little bit about the origins of Secrets of Happiness? What led you? I mean, there isn't one story in this novel. There are many stories, but there is a main story, or a inciting story. Could you tell us what led you to that?
Um, the inciting story, which I will reveal because it happened just a few pages after the part you just heard, is that the father has a whole other family, which has been keeping in Queens, and it's a Thai woman and her 2 kids who are teenagers by the time anyone finds out. And I came to that story because my friend Shari was in Japan. She'd found a way to go there with an artist residency, and she had just been through a bad breakup. And we thought, what a great thing to do! You know, instead of staying home and being miserable, you travel. And she was having a great time. And my friend Myra said, I knew a woman who traveled to Asia after she found out her husband had a whole other secret family. And the irony of that, she had a very good time going to this other place. The whole irony of that whole situation, just I thought, oh, that's a story for me. I just have to take that. I changed the country to Thailand because I knew Thailand better, and it fit with what I wanted to do with the story. And then the book sort of took off from that, and the other links kind of spurred out of that.
No, that's so remarkable. The English writer J.R. Ackerley, who wrote such novels as My Dog Tulip, he discovered at a certain point that his father had a second family, but just in the next town. And I believe his father bicycled back and forth between his families, which seems really risky.
I'm sorry, I read from that chapter, because it's the first chapter, it's when I read from, and every time I read, someone comes up to me afterwards and says, oh, I had an uncle like that.
Yeah.
So I think the second families are more common than I certainly would have thought before I wrote that.
How interesting. By the end of your book tour, you'll have a whole host of second families. Yes. In his glowing review of Secrets in the Washington Post, Ron Charles described the unusual form you use in Secrets of Happiness as being like a roulette wheel in print, which I thought was great. And I'm really fascinated by how you use this form. You used a version of it in Improvement, your last novel, and here it seems even more glorious. Could you talk about the form and how you came to it?
I feel like I've been doing versions of that form since Ideas of Heaven, which is 5 books ago. Those are more distinctly short stories, and this I did try to make it, a form novel. But I like the idea of things being in these different parts. It's been quite important to me to do that, and I think it's partly because, my whole life as a writer, which is now a long life, I've wanted to be big and small at the same time. I like the intimacy of the close gaze. I love, a kind of closer rendering of characters' interiors. But I wanted to find a way to expand on that in a way that was true to me, that wasn't just finding an artificial plot. So this way of moving around between different narrators, between different places and times has allowed me to do that. I feel like the work has been able to get larger through doing that. And I sort of think of all of these books as part of a continuing project that I'm trying different ways to do it.
So it's partly about what you include and partly about also, I imagine, being able to leave things out.
Yes, I don't have to worry about making connections I don't want to make because we're starting all over again with a different character. Yes, I think that's a really key part of it. Yeah.
And how do you decide who gets to tell their story? I mean, if I had had the good fortune to write Ethan's story, the opening chapter or section, I don't think I would have then turned to Joe, his half brother, in the next section. Do you audition characters or audition your narrators, or do they sort of walk onto the stage and claim your attention?
Audition is a very nice way to put trial and error, which is what I really do. Yes, I guess I do audition them. And this one, I knew I was going to try and do the other family because I felt that they should have their Time in the Sun. But after that, I really do make it up as I go along. I don't pre-plan. I knew in this one I was going to come back to Ethan in the end, that was sort of important, and to the mother also, who's kind of a key character to me, even though she's always on the sidelines. But I didn't know what was going to go in the middle, and what I was going to do with it, and so forth. I had certain ideas in mind, definitely, but certain themes, but I didn't know how they were going to function. So I like that about it. I like the improvising that comes out as part of the form, and the guessing on what's going to happen.
Yeah. And of course, it's important that at least some of your characters get to travel. Your characters would usually rather talk about food than books. But in this novel, you have references to Great Expectations, and I was very happy to see Treasure Island and hear the epitaph from Robert Louis Stevenson. Did you grow up in a house of books or a house of food, or both?
I would say both. My mother was a great reader. She was a little worried that I was so bookish I wasn't going to be able to get by in life, that I was too dreamy, but she very much respected reading and had been an elementary school teacher herself. And the house was full of books that had been my father's. My father died when I was a small child, when I was 5, and he himself was the son of a shoemaker, but he was a great reader, and he signed all of his books very formally, Samuel S. Silber. I still have some of those books. The first Chekhov I read was in the best known works of Chekhov, which he had, which had been his. So the books were very important. And certainly as a teenager, I talked all the time about books. I was very bookish. Food was also important, and food was often, as with many families, the peacemaker. If we could eat and if we could talk about food, that was crucial. But my mother made her own strudel. She was actually quite a good cook on some issues.
That seems an unbelievably hard thing to make. And I love the way in the novel you bring out that food is about so many things. It's about health and culture and sometimes happiness. And one of the many piercing moments in the novel is Ethan's description of going to that Thai restaurant where his father's second wife, smaller wife, younger wife, waits on them as the hostess.
Yes, and in fact, when he thinks, oh, it was her, he thinks, I was thinking about the barbecue chicken and sticky rice. I don't even remember what she looked like.
Right. And then later, when he's helping his boyfriend Kirk with Kirk's former boyfriend Saul, sorry, this is a little complicated, food becomes this kind of life and death question as they try to find things Saul will eat. So I just loved all that. Jane Smiley said in an interview, you've sort of answered this already, but she said that for her, one novel leads to the next. And you talked about how Myra offered you this story of the second family, but was there some way in which improvement led you to this novel, in which is very New York centered, but in which people do get to travel quite widely?
Well, I don't think improvement did. I wish, I always want it to. I always want to finish something, and and I'm always quite lost afterwards. And people think, oh, you could just take a break, but I am not the least bit happy if I'm not writing. I really need that to anchor my life. So I think I floundered around a little bit and was so glad to have, accidentally heard this story that I could use.
Yeah. And what about your relationship with travel? I mean, your characters are fools for love, but they're also fools for travel. They fall in love with travel. They believe in its transformative powers. Was there a moment when you suddenly felt sort of enraptured with travel? Or did you start at a young age?
I always wanted to travel. My mother was also a great traveler, actually, so I felt like it's something that an intelligent person does. I think sometimes I was disappointed I would travel and it wouldn't be wonderful, and I wouldn't quite know why. The most important travel experience for me before Asia was I went to Italy in the early 90s. My then boyfriend had a grant to be at the American Academy in Rome, so I was there for 9 or 10 months with him, and that was fantastic. And living there that long, and I mean, Italy isn't even that different from us, but it's pretty different once you're there. And the sense, I mean, I think it alerted me to what I would call parochialism, which is the idea that the way you do it is the way it's done. You know, that's just not true. So then in actually 2001, I got the idea that I wanted to go to China. I saw an ad, I was interested in Buddhism, and I saw an ad for a Buddhist trip that I ended up not taking. I think the trip didn't run and I took another trip, but I had never been anywhere near Asia. And once I went, I was just staggered. I just thought it was so fabulous and so interesting and you know, much further from us, you know, than any place I'd ever been. So it was then my job to go to as many places in Asia as I could. And I have tried to keep that up.
No, I think I met you during the time you were in Italy, and I remember vividly you're talking about it. And a novel about happiness has to be partly about money. And I felt that coming up throughout the novel, but perhaps particularly in Rachel's section. And I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit about Rachel's section and perhaps read from it.
Yeah, why don't I read first, and then I can tell about it. I'll be more intelligent if I can read first. I'll just read a page or two. This is Rachel talking. It's a woman talking this time. My brother's longtime boyfriend decided to leave him once and for all. Enough, he said, was enough. If you can't stop arguing after 20 years, when will you ever? Time for a new start for both of them. They would always be friends, of course. He would always care about Saul, but he did not think that waking up every day in the same apartment was good for either of them. This speech might have made sense, except my brother had just been diagnosed with some stage or other of leukemia, lymphocytic leukemia, and it was hard to get a full story out of Saul. And the apartment in the upper reaches of Manhattan belonged to Kirk, the boyfriend. My brother, a 57-year-old librarian with no personal savings, was going to have to find a new place to live for however long he planned to do that. I was stunned and outraged by the news, maybe more than my brother was. Why had I ever liked Kirk? I always had, with his deep voice, his good haircuts, his quiet, merciless jokes. He called me Sister Susie. My name is Rachel. The name was his kidding. Sister Susie was a perky lass, always getting into the gin on the sly. We had a whole set of stories about her and her unusual relations with her dog Spot. Some of his friends thought I was really called Susie. How could you decide to break up with someone who had a mortal illness? Who could do such a thing? Kirk could. The man is a fuckhead, I said to Saul, and he has no honor. We never got along that well, Saul said. Remember when he picked a fight with me in front of the entire Brooklyn library staff? He was always a pain. And you know how full of himself he's been. He thinks being a digital art director is like being Michelangelo. I always laughed at the way he used the word creative. Don't make a big deal out of this. It's not the end of the world. What is then? I thought, but I didn't say it. Kirk had not given him any particular deadline for moving out, and everyone in New York knew couples who stayed together for years after breaking up, while prices rose and good deals slipped away. Meanwhile, Kirk and my brother were sharing the same bed every night and were, I gleaned from my brother's remarks, still having what could be called sexual contact. I didn't blame Saul for mentioning it either, showing off the last bit of swagger. And maybe the breakup was just an idea, a flash in the pan theory. Maybe Kirk didn't mean it. He says I'm lazy about being sick, Saul said. I should do more, be proactive. Has anyone used that word since 1997? What is it with him? I said. I don't get it. He's seeing someone new, Saul said. He's what? I said. I had to stop wailing in protest because it was useless and only increased my brother's suffering. He had his ties to Kirk. He didn't want to hear what I had to say. No big deal was his mantra, and there was probably a way to say it in Sanskrit or Pali. "Is someone named Ethan?" Saul said, "a lawyer." Did I want to know his name? I did not. So as you can see, money is going to be an issue in this one because it's going to cost. I mean, Saul doesn't have the money to move out and find his own place, or doesn't have it readily available to him. And that's going to be the first squeeze on their relationship.
But later, Ethan I think he is quoting someone. He says how in divorces, people are always trying to kind of turn grievances into money or get recompense for things you can't get recompense for. Do you know
I know that line very well because I once worked, I was like errand girl for a lawyer when I was young, and they mostly handled divorce cases. And the cases were all about someone wanting money for something that wasn't a matter of money. You know, they wanted financial recompense for suffering. And it was not an equal, you know, it wasn't going to work. And I feel that I mean, certainly that occurs with all my characters. They are hoping for money, or, you know, that people want to be paid for things that you can't, you know, it won't work. It won't help.
Yeah. But of course, money makes a crucial difference, and that comes up over and over again when your bank account is emptied, or when someone won't pay for your son's education, or you need another apartment. You need money, and
yes.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and some of the characters also sort of audition spiritual possibilities for finding happiness.
In this story, the kind of unofficially adopted niece of Saul is chanting for him according to Buddhist, she's doing a Vipassana Buddhist chant, actually, in her own version of it. May you be well and happy. I wanted to sneak it. I mean, Buddhism has been very important to me, although I don't meditate, but I like all the other parts of it. And I wanted to get those ideas in as being important to the characters, and also to how they manage their own wants and their own desires, and what that particular way of thinking has to say about it. But I didn't want to hit people over the head with it. So Nadja kind of pops up every so often, the young niece, to give her ideas.
And I think somewhere Ron, in his the review I referred to earlier in the Washington Post, Ron Charles talks about how your novel is full of sort of you find lots of pieces of profundity, like lost change down the sides of a sofa. You'll just be reading along a very matter-of-fact sentence, and suddenly something profound happens, which I thought was a wonderful description. You taught for quite a number of years at Sarah Lawrence, and I wonder, what is the best piece of writing advice you give your students that you yourself find very difficult to take or follow?
That is such a great question.
I stole it.
I would say, because for years I taught the novel class to grad students, and I love teaching it, and I would always make them write a synopsis of the novel that they were going to start writing or continue writing in my class. They had to have some sort of, summary of where they were going, even if they changed it along the way. I have never done such a thing in my life. Sometimes I take notes, but I certainly don't have an overview, but I thought it was very good for them to have to do.
Yeah, sort of like mental push-ups, perhaps. And in fact, I hate writing synopses even after I've finished something. I mean, I think it's a very hard form, much harder than a sonnet, perhaps. And I should remind people that Joan is happy to entertain questions. So if you want to start writing questions in the Q&A, that would be wonderful, and I will be looking for them. I wanted to be sure to ask, because we are not literally but figuratively in a bookshop, if you had recommendations for reading, things old or new that you'd like to pass on to other people.
Well, I would recommend Margot Livesey's fantastic The Boy in the Field. I love that book. I bought so many copies for people. It's amazing. One thing that's beautiful about that book is it starts with a very dark incident. An injured boy is found in a field, and it certainly addresses the question of how such a thing could happen at the same time that it's a very entrancing sort of, kindly book in so many ways. I love what it does. I also loved Charles Baxter's book, um, the Sun Collective, which is, Charlie's books are always very idea driven in lots of ways, at the same time that they have all of these sort of wonderful, eccentric, quirky is maybe better, but really interesting, deeply drawn characters. I just love that book. And it's about the homeless, it's about growing older, it's about many things at once, very gorgeous. And I loved Paul Yoon's book, and see, I wrote down the title because I always forget it. It is called Run Me to Earth, and parts of it take place in Laos, where I have spent time. And his books are always sort of magical and strange and unlike anything else. That's quite wonderful.
And I have read all three of those books, it just so happens, and would join you in recommending Charlie's book and Paul Yoon's book, both wonderful and both very different. Just looking at the questions, turning to them, Lara asks, says, wonderful to see you both, and asks, Joan, how do you know when a book is done? And I'm going to be writing down the answer of this.
I'm always tinkering with it. And in fact, I was just finishing a chapter now, and I kept tinkering with that. I do have a reader. My friend Myra Goldberg is my reader, so that's part of it, and she will tell me if it's not holding together. I don't have a magic formula for that, and I think I tend to underwrite rather than overwrite. So it'll be a little skimpy before it's finally done. I have to keep pushing it, and it takes longer than I think it will. I don't know if I answered that satisfactorily, but.
I think almost everything about writing takes longer than we think it will. And if that weren't true, we would stop writing. I mean, if we truly knew what we were getting into.
Yes.
Sarah Weiss asks, how has the pandemic affected your writing life, if at all? What kind of difference has it made?
I think it's been easier for me than for lots of people. I love staying at home. I mean, or I like staying at home anyway. I mean, I didn't like it every minute. Certainly the hardest parts for all of us were in the beginning when everything was shut down and we didn't know how long it would last. I would say the effect on my writing life has been fine. I mean, I have fairly regular habits. I'm not pure about it, but I like to work between lunch and dinner, and I was happy to be less bothered. It was sometimes hard not seeing close friends in person. And certainly that's part of my writing life, to do that. So I've been very happy that I can do that now.
No, I too have felt that I'm among the deeply fortunate in that I do this thing that is mostly solitary and mostly at home. So, but one does miss that, the friction of real life.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yes.
Sherry asks about, says that somewhere you talked about Grace Paley's influence on you. I think maybe you studied with her at Sarah Lawrence. And might you say a little more about that?
Yes, Grace was my teacher my last year at Sarah Lawrence. It was a mixed genre class, and I thought that I wanted to write poetry. But Grace had the idea that all the would-be poets, although I'm sure she put it more nicely than that, should try writing fiction. So it was I had, of course, tried writing stories before that, but it was the first serious story that I really wrote. And having her as a teacher really affected me. I didn't decide, at once that was what I wanted to do, but I had that with me in some way when I did decide that some years later. Of course, she was a fabulous example. She was a person of great integrity as well as great charm. And the other thing I was just thinking, because people keep reminding me how much money is in this novel, which of course I barely knew when I was writing it. But Grace used to say, not when I had her as a teacher, but later, she said that the two great issues of adult life were blood and money, blood meaning family ties. And so no wonder, all of that plays out. But she was very important to me, absolutely.
I mean, I think that's a wonderful quote, but I also slightly rebel against it because I sometimes feel family just takes up far too much space in fiction, or at least conventional families do. And I know, at least in one novel, I tried to have nobody who had any relations. It didn't work finally, but everybody was going to be an orphan because I was so fed up with family relationships.
I utterly agree with you. And in fact, I have loved that in the work, the way you've maneuvered that. I think of it, I mean, in Grace's formulation of it, I think of it as meaning everything, including erotic love, that blood is all of those ties. Because certainly in this book, I do have more family, but I wouldn't say that was my great subject either, actually.
And I would just also add that I think of Grace's work as being very witty, and that's something that I also find in your work, that there are many, many moments of wit and humor. And in a recent, someone else has asked about Grace Paley's influence and asking, would you elaborate? So I won't repeat that question. Do keep asking questions. And Sarah Stone asks, can you talk a little about the ways you get to know your extraordinary characters, or the ways they surprise you over time?
Oh, well, they do surprise me. I mean, I don't know what they're going to do. I am making it up as I go along. So I don't, and in this one, and for instance, in the first chapter that I read, there's a scene where the wife of the man you heard about in the first, the wife who's discovered that she's been, deceived all these years, comes into contact with the Thai girlfriend. I mean, they're not really married. And I didn't know how the two were going to act with each other. So that, it sort of unfolded according to what I was guessing about them before, and, what I thought they would do, and what the stress of the situation they're in would call forth in them. So I am making it up as I go along. What was the question again? Let me make sure
about writing extraordinary characters, and can you talk about the ways how you get to know them and how they surprise you?
I think my other premise is that most people, certainly including myself, start off shallow in their response to anything. That the first thought is the cliched thought. And then as they're more confronted by whatever's happening, their responses are more substantial. And in the case of something moving through time, their characters deepen. In some ways, it's a premise of, I mean, people don't always get better through experience, but it is a premise of fiction that experience changes us and can deepen us. So I think that's how I get to know them. I mean, I put them through all this stuff and I imagine it.
Yeah. No, there's a moment when Ethan meets, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name. Do I mean Kirk, when Ethan meets Kirk and he says, "Oh, nothing bothers me."
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Kirk says, "I hope you're not bothered by the fact that I actually am living with someone else." And Ethan is so eager to sleep with him that he sort of says, "Oh, nothing bothers me. Everything's fine." And of course, excuse me, but I think everyone has done some version of that where you will fudge or lie or not be candid for the sake of getting what you really want, in the immediate situation.
And Ethan is, I think, surprised almost at the extent to which things about Kirk begin to bother him. I mean, I think the depth of his feeling comes as a surprise. Amy Walsh writes that very appropriately that you wrote a beautiful book of essays called The Art of Time in Fiction, which offered a series of ways for writers to think about and shape time. And she wonders if you are thinking about new ways to shape time in fiction, perhaps through your interest in Buddhism, or the way you're exploring your material in the roulette wheel, the roulette wheel form.
The way that you have used for some time that is a little unusual is what I call the biographical story, where we get someone's whole life. That is something I've done before, so it's not new, but I love doing that. And in this book, there's a character named, I've just lost his name, Bud, who we find out we meet him from the time he's a child, and he's close to 60 by the end of the story. So we've been with him all that time. And I love that form. And I don't think I knew for a long time that you could do that in short fiction. We're more used to that in novels. And I like I called it long times in short stories. I'm still most loyal to that in some ways as a form I like, although, I move from it when I want to do other things. I don't want it to do, I don't want to do it over and over again. I think I'm at an interesting stage now where I don't want to repeat myself, but I don't want to change that much either. So I'm being candid when I say that. So I'm grappling with, do I want to do something new with time? Do I want to see further things that I've done before? I do think about that, and I don't have an answer to you about what new I'm going to do.
And I remember in Ideas of Heaven, which you mentioned earlier, as the place where you first started experimenting with the form. I mean, several of these sections in that were people's whole lives, in effect, if I'm remembering correctly. And it was wonderful how you managed to be, as again you said it earlier, both big and small. You managed to give us an intimate sense of their lives, but also the arc of the life.
I love seeing that. I think when I was first hearing, probably as an undergrad, I was told that short stories are always about the scene in someone's life where everything changes. And I thought, it happens in a single scene? It's not unlikely, but it's not very often. And it wasn't my sense of life, actually. It took a lot to make me change. So I liked the idea of a form that would show that could show changes over long periods of time. I mean, I had a kind of loyalty to that, not only as a fictional mode, but as a belief about how life works.
Larissa asks, and you've sort of answered this, but maybe you want to elaborate in some ways. How different was writing this book compared to the first one? I'm finishing the first one and it feels like it's taking forever. I hope this feeling gets easier.
You're right. She's writing her first one, and
yeah.
Because I thought, is she reading my first one? And it feels like, no, she's writing her first one. So it does take forever. It took me much longer to write my first one. I don't know if that's a comfort or not. I think it took me a good 7 years to write my first one, at least. That's normal. The delay, it does get easier. I'm more confident that I will solve problems, when I'm working. I don't always solve them. I have some, chapters that got thrown away. And I think one of the dilemmas, and I think any writer would tell you this, is that each new book is a new problem. You thought you knew how to do it, but you didn't know how to do this one. So some of that is just built into the profession. I mean, that's just what we do. We make things hard for ourselves. We kind of, I always say my method is to bang my head against the wall while sitting at my desk. I mean, there's a kind of doggedness that's required of all writers, particularly writers of novels, because it's a very long process of seeing that through. But it does get easier. That's the good news.
That's the key message.
Right. Easy, but not easy.
And we have a couple more questions, and I will say that Ellen Voigt asked if you might read again. I don't know how you would feel about that, but we also have a couple
I'm
more
used to doing what
questions.
Ellen tells me to, actually. But if we have room, if we have time, sure.
Um, um, Carissa, ma'am, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Joan, you said you don't think family is your great subject. What is your great subject and how does it appear across your work?
Oh, I would say my great subject is how people start off shallow and get a little smarter by the, come to some depth of understanding through experience. And so they're usually dodos in the beginning in some way or wrong-headed. Um, in terms of like what core, I mean, I'm often writing about love and couples and so forth. Um, uh, and, and, and probably travel is a component of it, or displacement. That's part of it now. It was not always that way.
And I would add that for me, there's very often a spiritual dimension to your characters are on some kind of spiritual quest. In Ideas of Heaven, you say something like, religion and sex are always fighting over the same ground. And I love that about your work, how you bring the secular and the sacred together.
That's important to me. I want that. I want that in there.
And it's not around organized religion. It's around a kind of longing. And perhaps that longing is connected to the search for depth. I mean, to feel that life has more meaning.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Ron writes, the openings to your novels and stories are always so mesmerizing. How do you decide where, when to start or who to start with? And do you notice any patterns to how your openings change as you revise?
I would say the opening is the hardest. The beginning and the ending are the hardest parts. I'm trying to cue the reader into what the rest is going to be. So in the opening that you heard, he's talking about his father being away so much in Asia, and we later find out that that's fateful. So I tried to do that in a sneaky way. So later we say, oh, that's why, So that's part of what's going on in the beginning. And in the story, that the other one that you heard about Rachel and her brother, that's also that the whole issue of the brother's boyfriend trying to split up with him while he's ill is the crucial premise of the story. So I try to get that in early. And I think there's some sense I do if the character's speaking directly to us, even though we're not addressed, that or they're speaking to themselves. So I'm trying to tune that so that it sounds conversational and direct, but not cumbrous. And I would say the revising has to do with that.
And I think that's one of the most remarkable things about your voice is that it can seem almost artless. That it wears its learning and its depth and its understanding just very, very lightly.
Thank you.
I have to read this very complimentary question from Deborah Tannen. Joan, you're a brilliant short story writer and winner of the Penn Malamud Award. You've also written wonderful linked stories and, of course, novels. Is the experience of writing these different genres different?
Oh, that's a great question. The linked stories and the kind of novels I write now aren't that different. I sort of worked at kind of making up my own form, but it was very different when I tried to write single line novels. I think the first one is actually the most successful in some ways, in that it knew what it wanted to do and it did it. And the others have, they have their points. I'm not going to speak against them, but it was harder for me to do that form. It was less natural to me. So the way that I do it now feels more like what my sense of life is, particularly at the stage of life I'm in now.
Thank you. That was very illuminating. Karen asks, Joan, has teaching changed your approach to writing? And if so, how?
Well, it's sort of, I began teaching when I had only written one novel. So I think, and I wrote novels, for a while after, but I think that teaching pulled me toward the story form because that's what you teach. And I also understood it better from having to look at, I think it sharpened my sense of form to look at stories and to see how they, whether they felt complete or not. It's always the what's missing from this picture that you're trying to convey to a student. So that helped me. And I think that changed my writing the most, the form of the story.
And then, of course, for me at least, there's a way in which teaching allows me to reread certain stories and novels and talk about them with very well-informed readers. And that's been, for me, a huge learning experience in getting to understand how some things work. When
I first started teaching, and I was a young teacher, I was discussing some story with the class, and they saw all these things in it that I didn't see. Some famous literary story. They noticed the stuff I hadn't noticed, and I was sort of abashed because I was a new teacher. I thought I had to know everything. And of course, that's been the reward of it. They see all the stuff that I couldn't possibly see. No, I've loved that. I have.
No, it's it. And you may feel you've already answered this question in some way, but Joe Schuster asks, following on Deborah's question, which was about stories, linked stories, novels, when do you know the shape that a book will take?
I've kind of kept the same shape for the last 5 books in the basic idea of what it's going to be. So I'm not making a decision each time. I'm not saying, oh, maybe I'll do this. And I've wanted to make them more novel-like, that I wanted to unify them more while still keeping the narrator moving around a little bit. But I don't know how they're going to do it. And I don't know which parts are going to be lumps that don't work at all and which are going to feel vitally connected. So it's trial and error. I feel that's what I like the audition idea better that you mentioned before. That's sort of a nicer way to put it, that the component parts are trying out for it. But I figure it out as I go along, I think is the answer.
Yeah. No, I mean, trial and error is a huge part of writing for me, with many things in the second category. Shanu writes, when you write a novel, how much is coming from your own life experiences? Don't answer this question, Joan. We must never tell anyone.
Well, I would say no, and I can answer it in sort of a general way. I would say none of the experiences are mine directly, but I'm with all the characters. I'm inside all of them in some way. Their emotional logic is not entirely foreign to me. And there's certain kinds of characters I can't do. I never do people who are overly dominant or power seeking or controlling. That's not a type I do, so they're akin to me in some way. But at this point, I'm definitely not using my own experience directly.
No, and I'm sure, like all writers, you have a wonderful meal, or you see someone pulling a suitcase, or someone loses their hat on a windy day, and somehow later, a week later, 10 years later, it finds its way into your work.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm a little confused here. Jessica said very kindly that if you would like to end with a reading, that would be delightful, and it would certainly be delightful for me.
Okay, thank you, Margot. You're fantastic, and I'm so glad that we've got to do this. I'm gonna continue with the Rachel section, which you heard part of, and it ended with Rachel being told that Kirk, the boyfriend, had another lover on the side named Ethan. I was his big sister, 2 years older, but we were both old now. I was the one with a more chaotic sexual history. I'd been with a long list of men and lived with some very poor choices, but time had passed since those days. The daughter of one of my boyfriends, I was never into marriage, still lived with me after losing patience with both her parents, and she was already 23. I loved Nadja. I was glad to have her with me, but my apartment wasn't really one that could fit her and me and my brother too. An old bargain of a place in Hell's Kitchen. Not that Saul had expressed any interest in moving in. Was he looking at apartments? Not at the moment. At the moment, he was busy going to a clinic where they inserted a needle into a port in his arm and dripped chemicals into his veins. I went with him for this. It was not an adorable procedure, and it took a while. Nadja went to pick him up once, and Kirk went the rest of the time. He did. Saul would go home to sleep after the procedures. Who wouldn't? And he'd lie around with headphones on, watching Netflix for hours when sleep evaded him. The library was giving him time off with no trouble, and maybe he was never going back. He hadn't shown any improvement after the first round of chemo, and the doctors wanted to start something else. He was still losing weight. His nose looked bigger on his growing face. It hurt my heart to look at him. He could try to eat, Kirk said. He doesn't even try. I buy things he likes that he always liked. You know he likes those pecan crunch things. It doesn't matter. I had my own life, of course, my own work, my own loyalties. I had a decent enough job in human resources for a hotel chain, overseeing stingy policies and crazy rate changes. I was the old girl who'd been there forever and knew the ropes. Nadja liked to ask if I could game the system, get millions paid out in insurance for someone who was healthy. But I had to tell her that was beyond me. Nadja had a youthful attitude about the possibilities of cheating. Anyway, one night I was buying a supper at her favorite Mexican place in the West Village when I heard someone at a nearby table say, "Just be patient, okay?" I knew the voice. It was Kirk's. He was talking to a nice-looking dude in his 40s, arguing in that weary, reasonable way of his. I knew that tone. It must be his new lover, this not-so-happy guy in a dark suit. "I've been waiting a while," the guy said. Oh, were they waiting for my brother to die? Or just to disappear, to crawl off stage? I was choking with fury. Did I want to rush over and make a scene? Did I want to stay where I was to hear more? "Hey," Nadja said, solving the problem for me. "There's Kirk. Hey, Kirk." He took in the sight of us, waved. What a fuckhead. "Look at you," he called out to Nadja, across 2 tables in between. "You're looking great. Hi, Rachel. This is my friend, Ethan." We all nodded at one another. Even Nadja was taking things in. "Why does everybody all of a sudden know about this restaurant?" she said. "I hate the way it is now. All these people." "Everybody knows everything nowadays," Kirk said. "Not for the better either," I said. "We had a very nice meal," Kirk said. "Didn't you think so, Ethan?" "We're almost done. Don't mind us. Enjoy your drinks." And then he turned away from us and murmured something to Ethan. He could go ahead and pretend they were in another room. He could do what he wanted. "They'll leave soon," I said to Nadja, not that softly either. Around us, a speaker was playing, "Bésame mucho." The singer was pleading in long notes. We stood our ground, we chewed and drank. Nadja said, "I can't believe you had to bring him here." I didn't know they had left until halfway through my second bottle of Dos Equis, I looked across and spotted other diners at that table. "He thinks he's so slick," she said, "Mr. Not Embarrassed." He's like Woody Allen. The heart wants what it wants. Remember when he said that when he ran off with his stepdaughter, I said. Nadja had probably not even been born then, but she'd heard about it. "People think if they're honest about their cravings, it makes anything okay," I said. "That's a fallacy of modern life."
What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Joan. This was fantastic. And many, many congratulations.
Thank you, dear Margot, wonderful Margot. I'm so glad I had you with me to do this. And thank you everyone for coming. It was just wonderful to see all those names. Thank you.
I'll add my thanks too. Thank you so much to Margot and to Joan. It was just such a delight to spend time with both of you and to talk about this book. The link is there in the chat. If you'd like to get a signed copy of Secrets of Happiness, you can put in your order, and we'll have those at Greenlight Bookstore very soon. So thank you so much for spending the time with us, everyone, and have a lovely evening. Good night.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.